Well, start with the maternal side of the family. The McCormicks came here, right here to Bayview in 1832. From Ireland. And he worked in the quarrying business. We're just cutting stone. Then along came the Civil War, and he joined the then Colonel Benjamin Butler's 35th Infantry Regiment. He's a volunteer. And he went to the mighty Mississippi River, and he'd only been in the service like 6 months, and he was gut shot. When usually those, he'd be hit with a ball in the stomach, it's the end of you. But he lasted like 5 years in the hospital and then was discharged and sent home. And he lived well into his 80s. He didn't die until sometime in 1920 or so, 25 or 6, but he lasted a long time. And because he had a significant amount of property, that kept him busy. Plus, he also had, because he lived across the street from the school, what was it, Bradstreet, Reverend Bradstreet. The school down there was, by the fire station, was the Bradstreet School. He was the janitor there, which gave him income. In addition to, he could look across the street and look at his property. So he survived really well. He was in the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, and very involved with that. Every time they had to get together and all that stuff, he was off in all his regalia and had a big thing and well thought of. I have here in my genealogy papers the write-up of his funeral, and they had several honor guard groups from different, at least two honor guard groups from different organizations that showed up when they put him in the ground.
So is he in this cemetery at Bayview?
No, he's actually in, where is he? No, he's in the Catholic cemetery over off of Poplar Street.
Okay.
Was he a McCormack or McCormick?
Mick. He was a Mick.
And first name?
William. His discharge is on the kitchen wall. And I got that by a surreptitious event. Kathy was talking to one of the Cooney girls, and the Cooneys, a lot of them down here. She said, well, her significant other had found a discharge paper of one William McCormick up in the attic of the house because they had bought the house. And he was going to try to do something with it. So I went down and talked to him about it and identified it. And he says, here, take care of it. So I got it.
So his wife, while he was away for 5 years, how did she survive?
They were very resourceful people, in the sense that they had the property, they had apple orchards. There was a section of the land, asparagus grew very extensively, and there was a big market for that because it was thought to be a good item. They sold stone from some of the places. The first quarry, one of the first quarries, was right across the street here in 1832. And what's his name? Torrey, William Torrey, from Quincy, Massachusetts. And he did a lot, and there was a road that went from here, which is now a path, went from here down to Quarry Street. and they would cut the stone out of here and bring it down there and put it on the railroad and bring it down for cutting purposes. But the stone over here is like most of the stone in the Anscombe. It's terrible. It shatters. It doesn't cut well. It has too much quartz in it. And when you talk about these offsprings, they were resourceful. One of the the great grandmother and her daughter, my grandmother, they would take scrap materials and make hooked rugs, those rope type rugs, whatever you want to call them, and sold a lot of them. And they had a reputation as being the local hookers. How they survived in those days, there are lots of, if someone owned land, they worked the land, and if they could find a place to put a boat, they would still go out to sea and get some fish. They were versatile. Whatever allowed them to survive, or kept them alive, is what they did.
So that was your grandmother, the daughter of those two.
Yeah.
And then how did she find somebody to marry? Who did she marry?
She ended up marrying John Henry Paschal,
Okay. So
Paschal, and they were from Nova Scotia. There were 6 brothers in the family, and that was one of the reasons why, early on he was pretty successful because he, as I had mentioned, he received that coastal schooner, which was 90 feet on the waterline and 115 feet overall, good size one, as a wedding gift to go in business, because his brothers already had their own coastal schooners and they were transporting stuff all over the place. Coastal schooners back in those days were like truckers of today or railroads, same thing.
So he was given it by his parents?
No, he was given it by his mother-in-law.
His mother-in-law?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
put him to work.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh yeah, I have seen deeds on property where she was the holder of the second mortgage and stuff like that. There were no flies on her. I think they were paying rent.
And where was that? Do you know where that schooner was built?
It was built in Connecticut. The Irwin J. Luce. Apparently he was a very successful businessman down around Hartford or somewhere. And he had several boats, but this one ended up here. And when my grandfather sold it, he sold it to the Rockport Granite Company, and still sailed it for them. But then they were doing work on building the breakwater in Rockport, that big thing. And that was, in that day and age, very good money to work on that. And because of his handling a lot of stone, it was right up his alley. He had made a record trip from Lanes Cove to Boston, unloaded 125 tons of granite, and was back in Lanes Cove in like 4 hours.
Oh, my gosh.
And what's his name, Levitt, in his book, writes, Wake of the Coastal, and this Levitt is considered to be, the authority on the coastal schooners. He talks about that he was one of those sailors that always wanted to be in port first, and if you saw him behind you and the fog came in, next thing you know, he'd be in front of you, if you're out to sea. And back in those days, those coastal schooners had no engine, so you had to be a sailor.
And do you remember him?
Yes, I do. I remember him when he was kind of gaunt, and he spent his last years at the Sailors' Snug Harbor in New York, because he preferred to be there. And when he would come up here to visit, he would be in his captain's uniform, the whole business, sit out underneath the apple tree and just take it all in. And on the other side, the paternal side of the family, the great-grandfather came down from Newfoundland. And his father was very successful in the fish business up there. And there is a James Groves historical house that they restored.
What time and what town, Jim?
It was the town. It was the first settlement there was by Caboto, and the town was settled in 1497, which goes back a bit. And they were there. The Groves were there from the early 1700s on. They came over from the Shire of Dorset.
When did they come from Canada to the States, roughly?
Well, the great-grandfather came. He'd been back and forth because they were doing business with Gloucester in the bait business. Bait was unique in this sense because of the extent of the fishing industry in Gloucester. Bait was always an issue. They first started off using clams and things, but they used them all up. So they were then buying bait up in the Maritimes and everything else. And one of the interesting things that I noticed is that an awful lot of the successful fishing schooner captains were functionally illiterate when it came to language. But when it came to math, it was a different story. And that's because, my conclusion, when they were kids fishing, when they turned their fish over to whoever was going to pay them for it, they would be able to keep count because they cut the tongues out of the fish. So they say, well, I caught 150 fish today, and here are the 150 tongues to prove it. And that's what I want to get paid for, blah, blah, blah. So early on, they picked up their mathematical skills. And then when they became captains, they had to know what you needed in the way of provisions, everything else, to be able to go out to sea and take care of all that. And also, bait itself was sold by the fish. They would count them. There'd be, in the late fall and through the winter and stuff, they would be putting fish in a barrel, big barrels. And they would count them, change the numbers each time when they'd add to it. And when it got all frozen, they would cap the top and put it into the warehouse. So on every barrel would be the number of fish that were in it, and that would enable the captain to know how many hooks he could bait with the number of fish that were in the barrel. So they need to know their math, because if you miscalculated, you would be in trouble. But
What was the bait fish?
they used essentially whatever they could catch that they could use for bait. There were, and I can't recall in my readings what they specifically looked for. Like, for example, down here in Gloucester, when the redfish industry was big and they were landing, 1 million pounds a day, redfish was the bait of choice because it was there and it was cheap. And the meat on the redfish sold as ocean perch was firm, and it would fish for a fair amount of time. When things got tough and things weren't so great, they would use pogies. But they're slimy, they rot quickly because of they don't hold up very well in the warm weather. But they sold an awful lot of that stuff.
Was the Carolyn the only boat that you were familiar with Davis?
Yep.
And do you know what happened to it or anything?
No. I know he built a couple more boats after that. I used to see him every once in a while in downtown Gloucester and have a drink with him or shoot the breeze about something, but not too long. The guy who I used to talk to the most about what used to happen down in the Cove was Cal Cook. because once you got him going, he could tell you everything. And he built a lobster boat. He went lobster, and he said it didn't like it.
Well, it's hard work, but so is building houses. When did Bud, what season did he fish in? When did he start, when did he quit?
I don't know specifically, but I would expect that he would fish when there was a market for his lobsters. In the wintertime, for the most part, little or nothing. When the tourists started arriving, summer people who brought with them money and all that stuff, and the taste for lobsters, then that's when he put the traps out.
You run single pot?
Single. That's all I can remember pulling was singles. And he would actually set a trap in the sense that he would put it back in the location that he took it out of, because those were the places where he had been successful in getting lobsters in the past. In other words, he would come around, he would come about, and I said, just dropping it here. He would say, I want to be near this rock. You can see it, in the clear water, and drop the trap right there.
Anybody running multiple pot trawls back?
Not that I knew of.
Do you have any idea how many pots he might have run?
Oh, I know, well, for like two summers, we always built traps up in, he called it Young's Field, up off of Young's Road or whatever. There was a field up there off of Dennison Street, and there would be a pot building, not pot smoking, but pot building episode going on for several weeks. Because of the days when you didn't go out fishing, weather's bad, the lobsters aren't crawling. I heard a story the other day, some guy went out, a kid went out and pulled 200 traps and caught 3 lobsters.
And these were rectangular pots, right? Or not curved ones?
Half rounds, the other ones. As I mentioned to Steve earlier, when the question came up, down Maine, half rounds were popular because the tidal flow was very strong up there because of the tides from the Bay of Fundy and all that. And the half rounds seemed to stay set better. In other words, the way the trap is supposed to be functioning to catch a lot. If the trap's upside down, if the lobster wants to get in, you'll get in. And they like them. Lobstermen don't like to change things. Don't have to, same routine. So they built those half rounds for years and years. Down here, they were all square.
And how many, if you went out to work with them on the day, how many pots do you think you might pull?
It depends on how good the fishing was, how much bait you had, what the weather was like. Probably 40, 50 maybe.
So the pot comes up, Jim, and what's your job as stern boy?
The job is to basically take the trap, slide it down the railing so that you can get it towards the stern of the boat, and then open it up and see what was in there. Anything that looked like a keeper, you throw in a box.
What was he doing?
He was watching what was going on. There's lots of other buoys out there and things like that, You keep an eye on what's above, below, and around you.
Did you have the bags rebaited first?
You didn't use bags. You use either sticks or pieces of, say, 5/16 wire if you get a hold of some, and just stack the bait on that. Bags were not in existence. They didn't exist. And also the other thing was that today they put a band on the claw. Back then they used a wooden peg, and you would stick it in the claw so that it couldn't open, and depending on how fresh that wood was, like if it had a lot of sap, it was pine, if a lot of sap in it, the lobsters would have a reaction and they start getting stuff growing around that joint where the pegs went in. So you had to sell your lobsters quickly.
Jim, when you were fishing at Ipswich Bay back then, were there any seals?
Well, I can tell you from my own personal experience that seals are voracious eaters of lobster. They will tear a trap apart.
Jim, what about tuna?
Also pronounced tuna. There was 2 aspects of the tuna that I'm interested in talking about. Number one was there was a tuna association, tuna fishing association, and they called tuna down in New Jersey horse mackerel because of their size and all. And they were the premier organization for putting together tuna tournaments. So because one of their members landed a good-sized tuna up here, a couple of years later, and this is when Crown and Shield lived in Annisquam, he got them to come up here. They had a tuna tournament, a couple of them, big success. War came along and that all dissipated. After the war, they started it up again, trying to get it to go down here in Annisquam. And that's when there was a heavy sports fishing business for tuna fishing. And that only lasted for a couple of years because of lots of reasons, but the accumulation of reasons meant that it went elsewhere, and it never reached the status of whatever it was that it had prior to. But it was worth mentioning because I can remember guys like Hastings Gamage and Roswell Lane walking around Chad Wilkinson's with a cocktail glass in their hand. It seemed to be glued to their hand. They were having a hell of a time, and of course then they were going down the yacht club and living it up. But see, I had to be home by 6 o'clock, so I missed out on all that stuff. Besides, I was too young to drink. So, but it was a big thing, and it was interesting when these boats came up from down. When we said down south, New York, New Jersey, some came up from Florida, that the fishing gear and the equipment that they had, these Hatterases and all that stuff, it was just incredible. You didn't think anything that was swell existed, but it did. And when it came to the commercial end of it, you could harpoon tuna or you could keg line for them. And harpooning essentially speaks for itself. When there were schools of the tuna, you could gently glide into the school and poke away at them. Bunt had a rule of thumb that he wouldn't take on board any more than 4 because it was too treacherous. And the other thing was that when there were a lot of tuna around, the price plummeted. When there was very few, it might be 20 cents a pound. When it got down to tons of fish, 6, 7 cents a pound. And you had to call, I can't remember who it was that, we called on the radio, and a couple of times we had to dump a fish because it only takes so many, 2 out of.
Did the fish dealers send a truck to Annisquam, or did they have to go through the gut?
You had to go through, they had to bring them in. And usually when it came to that, I would come ashore and Bunt would proceed to Gloucester because I would be going home. Get on my trusty bicycle and go. And the keg lining was interesting because they would take what was essentially a barrel, very small barrel, that nails came in at the time. And the other one was with the foundry down in Rockport. The kegs they used were extra heavy duty because the wedges and the feathers that were used for splitting the stone, they would sell those by the keg. And those barrels were the best to get because they were solid oak, tight, and they could take a pounding. Because once that fish went under, the keg went with them. And then the flag would come up, when they start coming up again because that's tough to pull. You tire them out and then go over and retrieve the flag and the keg. And
Did he use his pot hauler to pull the line back up, or what did he use?
the line was pulled up by hand because you would have you'd have 3 or 4 lines out at the same time. So once you were going after a fish, you had to get the others in fast. So there would be a couple of people working on, depending on what he had for a crew, pulling on the line to get bushel baskets. And a lot of line.
Did he make his living fishing?
I don't know that he did anything else but that. Because he never said anything. On days they had planned to go out, and there were changes in the plans, his wife would call the house and talk to my mother and say, you know, Bunt's not going out today, and blah, blah, blah. So my mother said, oh, I have some things for you to do. So my days of going off into the woods blueberrying or whatever are history. But I enjoyed it. Had a lot of fun.
Or how old when you started, roughly?
I gotta say, 10.
Did you do it through high school?
No. When I was in high school, I was over in Magnolia, but I had a lobster boat and traps of my own.
Yeah, how did you end up in Manchester with lobstering?
Well, that's a good question. I was working in Boston. I got to say, I was in the insurance business, working in Boston, and somebody, a fellow that I knew from Manchester, knew I was looking for a place to live, and he said, so-and-so has got a nice little apartment down in Manchester. And that's how I got there. So I ended up getting along with everybody, and the next thing you know, I'm out fishing and all that stuff. And that was when I bought my first boat over there. I bought it from a fellow named Hal Johnson. And he was in his early 80s. Man, was that old.
Nobody could be that old.
Older than dirt. So he was ready to chuck it all in, and he offered for sale his boat and license and a possibility to talk to the harbor master about getting the mooring. I didn't need the license because I already had one. So I bought the boat, and we met at Table 4, which was a watering hole, 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and harbor master gave me the stamp of approval. I could take over the mooring, and so we all had a celebratory beverage to seal the deal. But that was the beginning of it. And I fished out of Manchester for a long time. I always refer to it as my working hobby, because I never made much money out of it, but I had a hell of a lot of fun.
How many traps did you run at the peak, Jim, out of Manchester?
Probably close to 300 at the peak. I was young and ambitious.
Did you use multiple trawls?
Yep, anywhere from 5 to 7 traps.
On that little blue thingy?
No,
On the bigger boat?
a bigger boat. I had a 36-footer.
Right, okay.
So did you build all of your traps
Yes, I did.
in the winter?
Right down here in the cellar. I had a shed down the street here on the land that I owned, but we built this house. On Saturdays, the routine was, after I got everything done I was supposed to do, then the cat, Blackie, and I would go down to the cellar, turn the radio on to the Texaco music hour at the Metropolitan Opera. The cat would crawl inside of a lobster trap, and I would be hammering and pounding away.
Did you slice up your own wood, or?
Then I was into metal, wire traps.
Before that, though?
Yeah,
Or did you buy the stock?
mainly I used to buy what they called kits, because like when I cut up the wood for this, to make this one trap, geez, I'm going through an awful lot of lumber to do this. And It is. But for a mill, it's a good deal because you can use random widths and lengths and be able to get a saleable product that you can sell. And there were, like, I was thinking the question might come up, so as where would you get it? There were, Babe Melanson was over in West Gloucester. He had a mill. Burnham in Essex was another one. In Rowley, there was Herrick. And there was another one in Groveland, which was cutting pot stock, as I used to call it.
Oak?
Always oak, yeah. It's the most durable wood that's around for that.
White, red, or both?
White, red, green, yellow, whatever it was.
As long as it was oak.
As long as it was a good hardwood.
And when did they switch over to wire traps?
I'm going to say that happened sometime. There's an interesting story that goes with that. There's a fellow by the name of Jim Knott, Knott, who summered over here in East Gloucester. And he had a mill out in Northbridge, the Riverdale Mill. And he made coated wire. So he perfected a coating that when you bent the wire, the coating wouldn't split. It would have enough elasticity in it to keep the coating on the curve so the trap would last longer. And it was an exceptionally good product. And the first uses of it were right down here off of Gloucester. So there was a guy who started up in Salem, Massachusetts, and he was building the wire traps. And I went up to see that and I said, this is the way to go. And from that day on, wire traps. Kathy has some pictures of my trap making ethic of the wire traps.
Where was the best fishing, especially in Beverly?
Well, see, you've touched upon a very sensitive subject. To ask a fisherman where a good fishing spot is. You never.
You're beached, and so am I, so it
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
Essentially, it depends on the time of the year. But you can dig them out of the rocks close to shore almost all the time.
How about the sewage outfall in Beverly Harbor?
Oh yeah, but they all come out, mottled, different things growing on them and all that stuff. It's not really good lobstering.
So you
If somebody doesn't, if they're not going to be looking at the shell and they're just at the meat, after someone has cooked it and shucked it, then that would work out.
June, I would like the story of of working down at Herb Montgomery's yard when you were working on a boat, which was a gorgeous boat, little boat. You alluded to it, but
For some rich kid in Oswald.
yeah.
Well, it was Nick and the old man, Nick Montgomery and Tom Norwood, who would be the ones who would say, oh, we're building, look at this boat, isn't this nice? Nice skiff. So we're putting a lot of extra work into this, we'll make it look good. And I said, who is it? Who's got that? He said, oh, some rich kid. He's going to get it. And when it came to launching day, I got more than one message to say when I was in the yard. I said, oh, they're going to launch that boat pretty soon. You better be there to see it happen. He says, I don't want to see that. He says, come on, you got to see it. So as I'm standing there and they're milling around, there's like half a dozen people milling around because they wanted to see the launching. And my father drove into the yard and he turned around and went into the back of the truck and picked up the outboard motor and went over and put it on, by the boat. He didn't put it in, he didn't put it on the boat, but by the boat. And said, now we're ready to go. So I'm dumbfounded. Why is my father involved in this? So he came over and he said, You'll soon have plenty of work to do. Here's your new boat. You can enjoy yourself. And that was the beginning.
Was that more? Was there more to that story where you were going about Alpheus Hyatt?
There's, basically, it's opening a crack in the door that then becomes like opening up a barn door. I mean, wow, because of what came out of his departure from here to go down to Cape Cod. And of course, that raises a question, why would a person want to leave a cape that's named after a queen to go to a cape that's named after a fish? In that picture that we have of the lab down in the cove, that windmill was used to pump water to his holding tanks or whatever he had inside. And that cove has been polluted in 1888, right up until, was it 8 or 9 years ago, they finally declared the Annisquam area, including the cove, pollution-free, relatively speaking.
So was that a contributing factor to him leaving?
Oh, I think well, I think the contributing factor is that a bunch of Bostonians put together a package of $10,000, which was an awful lot of money back in 1888, and persuaded him we'll put up a couple of buildings, and we'll make you the head of this laboratory, and you can do your thing. And he took advantage of that. And the thing with this, the federal government, a guy named Bard, B-A-I-R-D, was the moving factor behind the fisheries as far as the government is concerned. And he was down there. So when Hyatt went down, this Bard was very, he worked in conjunction with Alpheus Hyatt to be able to supply him with necessary things that he was looking for. But by virtue of the fact that you had one ecology, the Gulf Stream bouncing off the Cape on the south side, and the cold water coming from the north on the north side of the Cape, you had an ideal position to look at two separate ecologies and get data from there to compare what happens. Lobster trap that was used on Cape Ann on North Shore and going up to, across the border into New Hampshire. It is basically somewhat square, but it's like this so you can stack them. The nomenclature is, this is a post and lintel design. These being the posts, this being the lintel. And every trap would have 3. So you have that. In here would be, this is called the kitchen. Lobsters would come in, and the twine is, the netting is a head, called a head. I don't know exactly why. But the lobsters would come in here. There would be bait on a stick, any kind of a contrivance to hold it here. And I haven't put it in yet, but there's a much larger net, and this is known as the parlor. So the thinking behind this is, the lobsterman's thinking is that the lobster would come in, eat the bait. Because they're cold-blooded, they would have to rest afterwards, and they would migrate into the parlor and take a nap and mingle with other lobsters. There'd be 4 bricks or 2 bricks, whichever way you want to do it, depending upon where you were, how many bricks you had that you could use, and the placing of them. If you were in where there were strong tides, you want to have 4 bricks each corner of the trap. in a relatively quiet area where there wasn't a lot of turbulence, and I mean serious turbulence, you only need two, but you would put those in the rear of the trap. There's a line that hitches to the buoys, up to your buoy, and that's called a bridle, just like on a horse. And the placement of the bridle, if you were hauling with a hauler, it would be around here. If you were hauling over the side of a skiff or a dory, it would be down here lower because of the center of gravity. The further you have your body over the railing of the boat, choppy seas, etc., the more risk that you take. So it's much more convenient and safer to have that line down here. And then also, these are called sliders, as everyone's here, or runners, and they take the beating of traps being dragged around and everything else. Again, on boats, skiffs, dories, you bevel this end of the slider so that when you got up against the railing, the rub rail of a skiff or a dory, you could get it over there. You wouldn't hang up on it. And on the skiff or dory, we put a piece of duck canvas, heavy stuff, over so that you could, it wouldn't wear out the railing as you pulled it over. On the regular, full-size lobster boat, you wouldn't worry too much about that. You wouldn't have to. And the fallacy that lobsters, once they're in a trap, are trapped, is just that, a fallacy. Because when the University of Maine, University of New Hampshire, University of Rhode Island put in TVs underwater so you could watch what goes on in a lobster trap, you would see the lobsters coming and going. And a freshly baited trap, it would be like Grand Central Station. You would have everything there. You would have crabs, you'd have small fish, big fish, codfish, cunners, starfish would come in, whelks. They were all there. And they got out as easily as they got in. So the ones that thought they were finding a home, or you would be there at the time they catch them, there's a lot of luck to it. This basically is on a design that I remembered, which goes back. I like to build them sturdy because you get a couple more years out of them. Usually a trap is good for like 3 years, but you spend your life building traps. It's not always a good thing.
Jim, when do you think was the right time to let a pot soak? After you bait it.
As soon as you put a trap over, put bait in it with the rocks and everything else, whatever you're going to make sure that it settles to the bottom, it'll start fishing right from the get-go.
Did you try to pull your pots whenever you could, or the next day, or?
Well, one of the things, because I always had a day job or jobs, I would, it worked out well for me because I could let the traps fish for 2 days, a week, 10 days, whatever. And for me, that worked out.
I would have thought they'd been pretty bare by the time you came out.
No, that's it. Some of them, when the trap doesn't move for a few days, they think it's a home. They move in. And you would make a door that would go on the top that you would open up and reach in and take out the lobsters.
So there was netting all the way around?
No, there's, I haven't brought them up, but you make these are called laths, and you would have them running from here to here with like a 1/2-inch spacing. And also on the back and on the front, but those laws would be vertical, because you'd always carry a few extra on the boat, because if anything got broken, you could take that spare lath, put it in. If you had them going this way, horizontal, the problem is that you would need a short one here and a longer one down here. So it works so much better when they're all the same length.
So the netting is really just those two sections. The net part is just those two, and
Yeah.
the one on the other side.
Yeah, you have the two kitchen heads, and then the parlor head, which is big. I worked on one last night. We'll see how it works out. It has been, because of the advent of the wire trap, it has been 45 years since I built a wooden trap. But one interesting thing that in building this that I remembered was that you would make up a fixture so that everything would fall into place. There was the frames would be spaced correctly, and we would fit in there, and just after you put your frames together, you put them in there, and then you was basically assemble it from the inside out. These have a slight taper to them, angle, and you make a little fixture for that, so you get the same angle all the time, and you drill one way, then you turn this one over and drill it the other way, so it all fits together. But it works out pretty good, and I can remember building, like every winter, maybe anywhere from 60 to 80 traps. And what I would do after a couple of years of the older traps, I would just sell them. And that means I would get something for what I get some revenue back.
So when you were doing the knitting, how long would it take you to make one of those headers?
I don't know, because what I would do was I had an arrangement, and I think my wife told you she took some pictures of it. I had this, you use a snap shackle with a swivel and make a loop-in piece of line, put it into the swivel eye, and I would hold it with my toe, and I would sit there and watch TV and knit. I could bend a lot better then, and fingers worked a lot better then. I didn't mind doing it.
Did you screw those together in those days or nail?
Galvanized nail, and it became at one time, it was a lot of Chinese and Japanese galvanized nails coming on the market, and they were terrible. So I worked in the insurance business in Boston, and one of my customers who knew I went lobstering, and he owned half a dozen hardware stores, we were talking about it one day, and I was talking about the nails, and he said, well, you ought to go over and see, I forget his last name, Cy so-and-so, he's in the nail business in Chelsea. So I went to see him, and of course I went with a suit and a tie, and he's shuffling the papers around. So I introduced myself. He says, you're not with the IRS? I said, no, I'm not. So I mentioned the guy's name who sent me over. So he turned out to be the best find of the year, because he knew exactly what I was looking for, and he knew exactly where to get them. So he would get me some. And I said, well, you're not doing anything here. I said, you just come here and sit here all day? He said, yeah, just about. I said, well, that's good. He said, well, my son has the business, and he's down in Canton, and he has one of the largest nail suppliers in New England. He said, so he pays me to stay up there and out of the way, and it works out fine for me, so I'm glad to get you your nails. So I was selling nails at no markup to a lot of the guys that I knew that were lobstering and building their own traps.